What's up? This is Mr. Ippolito, and today I'm going to go over how did we get here. The purpose of this assignment is basically to review everything that you should have learned in 5th, 6th, and 7th grade history that is relevant to what we're going to be learning about this year in 8th grade U.S. history. So I want to take you through this just in case there were some answers that you missed when we went over this in class. Also in class, we might go over it a little bit quickly, but I want to make sure that you get all of it. Now, at some point, we have a dessert that's baking in the oven. So at some point, the timer is going to go off. I'm going to pause this, and then I'll come back in case you're wondering what's going on. All right, so let's go ahead, and we're going to get started up here with the first question right here. So first question. Christians from Europe first got a taste of goods from Asia in what series of wars in the Holy Land from 1095 to 1291? So the answer to that is the Crusades, right? So the reason why we mention this and the reason why it's important is because when Europeans first were going to the Crusades and when they were coming back from Asia back to Europe, they're like, you know what? There are a lot of really cool like silks and spices, pepper, paprika, cinnamon, cardamom, like all of these spices that they encountered from the East, from Asia. They came from India, from China, and they're like, we want those, but we don't want to have to go all the way in a treacherous overland route to get to them, nor do we want to pay all of the middlemen, like those traders, like the spice route traders, all of that money. It was very, very, very expensive to get those goods from India, from China, all the way to Europe. So they're thinking, you know what there's got to be a faster way. So rather than going east, or rather than getting their spices through those middleman traders from the east, let's try to go west. Let's try to set sail and see if we can go west. And so that's the Crusades is kind of what got Europeans starting to think about, could we find a better, faster route, a water route to Asia? Okay, next question. What Italian explorer wrote a book about his travels to China in the late 1200s, inspiring future explorers to find a faster route to the east? Or if you've ever played the swimming pool game, Marco Polo, there it is. He wrote a book about his travels to China, again, inspiring Europeans to want to travel, to want to find a faster way. And so this is, again, going to draw them into the Atlantic Ocean instead of going east, overland into Eastern Europe, and then over into, near Asia, what is today Syria, Jordan, Israel, like through there, through the Holy Land, and then into, places farther, India, China, that kind of thing. They wanted to try to find a better, faster route to the east. And so this is, again, what is eventually going to inspire the discovery of the New World, the discovery of the Americas, keeping in mind, I'm going to pause really quickly and let my dog out. The dog was barking at the birds flying over the backyard. Inspiring European traders to try to find a cheaper, faster water route to Asia. Okay. Moving on, let's move on to our next one. What Italian explorer financed by the King and Queen of Spain discovered a water route to the Americas in 1492? That was Christopher Columbus. Now, it's important to note that Christopher Columbus was looking for Asia. He thought that when he had sailed west from Spain and landed in the islands of the Caribbean, specifically the island of Hispaniola, and he encountered what we know today as the Arawak Indians, the Arawak tribe. He called those islands the Indies because he had thought he had landed in the islands off the coast of India. And so he called the islands the Indies. And then he called those people, the Arawak tribe, he called them Indians. Now, that name has stuck for the last over 500 years now. We still call Native Americans American Indians, all because of Columbus's mistake, right? He didn't actually find a water route to Asia, although until the day he died, he thought that he did. What he did instead was he discovered a water route to the Americas that then others would follow, right? And of course, there has been this myth that persists for a long time. That was like, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then he discovered America. Well, first of all, other Europeans had been there first, had been to the Americas, most notably Leif Erikson, the Viking, in around the year 1000. The Vikings were there far before Columbus ever got there. Second of all, there were already Native Americans who were there, and their ancestors were there for thousands of years, right? Because they crossed that Bering Land Bridge from Asia into North America. So it would sort of be like me showing up in your front lawn one day and planting a flag in your front lawn and saying, I discover this land in the name of the Ippolito family. And you're like, you come outside and you're like, Mr. Ippolito, what are you doing here? Well, I have discovered this land. And you're like, well, but my family and I, we already live here. So It's kind of the same thing. Like, you can't discover a place that where people are already living, right? But he did inadvertently discovered a route to the Americas, which then is going to inspire other explorers to follow. In 1534, this English king broke away from the Catholic Church and formed the Church of England. That is going to be this guy with 6 wives, King Henry VIII. And the reason why he's important is because he stood up to a powerful authority figure, right? He stood up to the Catholic Church, at the time the most powerful institution, certainly in Europe, perhaps in the entire world at that time in the 1500s. And he decided, because he wanted to do something different, he rebelled and he broke away from the Catholic Church. So ironically, this is King Henry VIII is going to help inspire the Protestant Reformation, right? Inspire the breaking away of different groups of Christians away from the Catholic Church, which at the time had been kind of the one institution of Christianity in Europe for, 1,500 years, right? And so by King Henry VIII breaking away from a powerful institution and forming Church of England, that a couple hundred years later is going to be like, well, American colonists will think, well, people like King Henry VIII were able to do that and break away from this giant, powerful, massive institution. And so if he could do it, well, why can't we do it too? If he could think for himself in matters of religion, why can't we think for ourselves in matters of government and politics? So that's why I'm going to say that King Henry VIII actually helped to inspire the American Revolution. Also connected and influenced because his 2 of his daughters, and then one of his nephews, cousins, whatever, the American colonies are going to be named after them, right? So his first daughter, Queen Mary, Maryland is going to be named after her. And then his second daughter, Elizabeth, who will become Queen Elizabeth I, her nickname was the Virgin Queen. She never married and she never had children. And so she was nicknamed the Virgin Queen. And Virginia was named after Queen Elizabeth I. I'm going to pause briefly, go take that out of the oven. I'll be right back. It still needs a little more time. It's not quite done. But we are done with this slide, and so we're going to move on. Next, what religious movement started in Europe in the 1500s when people started to question the Catholic Church? And the answer, of course, is the Protestant Reformation, right? This is Martin Luther right here. He was another one of those leaders of the Protestant Reformation, along with King Henry VIII. And again, it's this idea of challenging powerful institutions and going up against the status quo and rebelling, right? So his act of rebellion and King Henry VIII's act of rebellion, that helped to start inspire other thoughts of, well, hey, maybe there's not just one way to do things, and maybe we could challenge authority. And so the Protestant Reformation is going to also, in my view, and for many other complex reasons, is going to help inspire the American Revolution. All right. In 1607, English colonists created this first permanent settlement in Virginia, named after the King of England at the time. Now, if you were trying to look this up, you could, if you were doing a Google search, you could either search for first permanent settlement in Virginia, and you probably would yield the answer on that. Or if you looked up who was the King of England in 1607, and you could look that up. The answer, who was the King of England, it was Elizabeth's cousin, James. And this is not that slide. Where is it? There it is right there. My slides are a little turned around. Anyway, it is Jamestown, named after King James. Queen Elizabeth didn't have any children, and so when she died, the monarchy passed over to her cousin, her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, his son, James. Anyway, it was named Jamestown, and so the woman you see over there in the picture, that is actually Pocahontas, and she was a member of the Powhatan tribe. She was a princess of the Powhatan tribe, and she was part of that tribe that encountered John Smith and John Rolfe and that first wave of English settlers. Okay, I'm going to try to pull this back in order here. I think I have the same. Okay, anyway, the question that is supposed to be here is, what were the 3 countries that owned land in the, the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, whatever. The 3 biggest European powers at the time were Great Britain, France, and Spain, right? Now, the land that was owned by Great Britain is going to become, you can see over here, is going to become the United States. France kind of dips in and out in different parts of history, owning different sections of land, but France will end up owning what is going to become the Louisiana Purchase. We'll learn about that, but this is basically, and Louisiana, of course, named after King Louis, I think Louis the 14th or Louis the 16th, one of the Louis. That's where we get the name Louisiana. And then finally, all of this land was at one time owned by Spain. Little settlements, British settlements and Russian settlements up here along the Pacific coast, but most of this land, by and large, owned by Spain, including the land that we are on right now here in Southern California. Spanish, well, Native American languages were spoken here for thousands of years, and then Spanish was the predominant language of California, and then California became a state in 1850. California Constitution, fun fact, was written in both English and Spanish. There were more Spanish speakers in it here in 1850 than English speakers. So there you go. All right. So that answers that question, although I didn't show you the little question box. But Great Britain, France, and Spain is the answer to that question. Okay. There we go. What group created the Plymouth colony in 1620 seeking religious freedom? And what was the famous ship? So this is something you probably learned in 5th grade and maybe even earlier when you were learning about the story of Thanksgiving, right? So it's the Pilgrims. Now, these Pilgrims are separatists, and it's important to note that the separatists, again, you were supposed to learn all of this in 5th grade history. Separatists are different than Puritans, although they look similar and they kind of wear those same buckle shoes and the buckle hats. And so they're similar, but they're dissimilar. I'm going to point those out. I'm going to go check the oven and see how that dessert's doing. Stand by. The dessert's getting close. It's almost ready. The separatists, with the Pilgrims, they actually wanted to... So the Puritans thought that they could purify the Catholic Church, like there were some things wrong, but we could purify it. We could purify Christianity. A whole other conversation. The separatists did not believe that they could purify. They just wanted to completely separate. And by separating... Actually, it was Church of England that they wanted to purify or separate from. The separatists, they just wanted to completely separate themselves from Church of England. They were alienated in the process, and so alienated that the separatists ended up being persecuted for their religion in England, and were so persecuted and denied certain rights because they did not belong to Church of England. They separated from Church of England, that they just decided, you know what, we don't want to be in England anymore. We are being treated like second-class citizens. We want to practice our religion, our form of Christianity freely, and so we're going to go. And so I think they went to the Netherlands for a while, and then eventually they would take off and leave from Plymouth, Massachusetts, and then ultimately, Plymouth, England, and then ultimately land in Plymouth, Massachusetts landed in 1620, and then celebrated the first Thanksgiving in November of 1621, celebrating the people who had managed to survive that first very harsh year in the New World. All right. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut all form what group of colonies? So that is the New England colonies, right? So, and at the time, it's important to note, I think worthy of noting, that Maine, of course, today we know Maine is a separate state, but back then that land was owned by Massachusetts. Eventually, New Hampshire will become its own colony, and then there's Massachusetts, and then what will become, this is sort of like 1600s map right here. Eventually, it will become the colonies of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and then New Hampshire up here. Vermont is going to come later in 1791. Maine will become a state in 1820. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware are collectively called the Middle Colonies, because aptly named because they are in the middle, in between the New England colonies and the Southern colonies down here. And then, of course, finally, the group of colonies all named after kings and queens of England. Those are the Southern colonies. Maryland named after Queen Mary. Virginia named after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. North and South Carolina named for the Latin version of the name Charles. Carolus is the Latin form of Charles. Excuse me. And so King Charles I gives us... No, King Charles II gave us North and South Carolina, and finally King George gives us Georgia there. Did I say Charles I? I'm not sure it's the first or the second. Anyway, it's one of the two Charleses. The 13 colonies were all colonies of what country? Of course, they were all colonies of Great Britain. And so we're going to, and if you said England, that's okay. But the more correct answer is to say Great Britain, because when England and Scotland... when they drafted the Act of Union in 1707, then Scotland and England came together to form Great Britain. I think that dessert is ready now. I'll be back. All right. Well, hello. Hey, it's Mr. Ippolito. We did the first half in my last recording, and that was yesterday. And so now it's today. I've got a new shirt. It's a new shirt. It's a new day. And so now we're going to record the second half of the presentation. So let's go ahead and we're just going to pick up right where we left off. Here we go. Next question. What war from 1753 to 1754 to 1763 had Great Britain and her colonies fighting against the French and Native Americans for control of North America? The answer is the French and Indian War. Let me move myself over here. There we go. So the French and Indian War is often referred to as like the dress rehearsal for the American Revolution. It's sort of like where when I say we, I mean both the British and the American colonists kind of prepped and got ready for what that Revolutionary War would look like. So at the time, you have to remember the American colonists during this war here, they were very much British citizens, right? And so you see this painting right here of a young George Washington. That's when he was an officer, I believe a colonel in the British Army. That's where he's a redcoat, right? So he is, and he was horrible, by the way. He made a lot of mistakes and he learned a lot of lessons during his time as an officer in the French and Indian War. So it was good training and it was good experience for him to prepare to be a general in the American Revolution. As a result, there are a couple things that happen and the reason why this war is important. Number one, because France's power in North America is diminished. That's part of it. But another big important reason why the French and Indian War is so, it's such a big deal is because as a result of this war, Britain incurs a great deal of debt. And essentially the reason why we went to war, this was part of the larger 7 Years' War. There was war going on in Europe and right here in North America. But the reason why kind of this part of the war broke out was because the American colonists were kind of launching incursions. They were moving beyond the Appalachian Mountains and kind of moving into areas where they should not have been going. So if it's one thing that Americans are really good at, it's not following rules. And one of the things that we were not supposed to do was we were not supposed to cross over the Appalachian Mountains. We were supposed to stay along the coastal areas of North America. And of course, we're often not very good at following rules. So as a result, there were these incursions, these sometimes violent flare-ups between the American colonists and the Native Americans, and that was land that was owned by France. And so eventually it blew up into a full-scale war where the Native Americans and France are fighting against Britain and her colonies, right? And so then after the war, Britain's like, okay, here's the deal. We're going to draw a line. We're going to make it very, very clear. You cannot cross this line. This is the Appalachian Mountains. We're going to see that map in just a moment. You may not cross this line. And that's when Great Britain started taxing the American colonists, basically to pay back all of the debt from this war. So had the Americans just sort of kept to themselves to begin with, this might not have happened. The taxation without representation might not have happened, and we might not have ever had a revolutionary war. But the fact is that in America, the American colonies were expanding, and these adventurous Americans were moving and kind of spreading westward. And so that was what caused that flare up. It's what caused the French and Indian War, and ultimately what's going to lead us down the path to the American Revolution. Okay. Next question is, in the Proclamation of 1763, Great Britain decided that the Americans should not be allowed beyond what mountain range we've been talking about. It is the Appalachian Mountains. So you can see right here, there's that line right there. So this line, the Appalachian Mountains right here. And basically it's Britain saying, no, you cannot cross this line. And of course, we still, as Americans, we still continue to, not follow the rules and still cross the line. All right. In 1765, Great Britain passed the first tax on the American colonists to help offset the cost of defending North America. Named this tax on newspapers, legal documents, and other printed goods. When we talk about documents and printed goods and newspapers, hopefully you remember from 5th grade that this was the Stamp Act, right? The Stamp Act of 1765, where basically any paper goods, playing cards, newspapers, anything could be taxed by the British Crown. This was the first of several different ways of taxation. There was the Woolens Act, there was the Iron Act, there was the Stamp Act, there was the Sugar Act, there was the Molasses Act. So Britain was, again, they were just trying to kind of recoup the costs of protecting the colonies. But the colonists, who had sort of been left to themselves for a really long time, it was a policy called salutary neglect, where essentially the British government was like, you know what, we're just going to let you do your thing. It's sort of like if a parent just sort of lets their teenager just sort of do their own thing, kind of do their own thing, and you kind of leave your teenager alone. And then your teenager gets in trouble, which is kind of what happened in the French and Indian War. The Americans got in trouble because we started fighting with our neighbors. And so then all of a sudden afterwards, the parents start cracking down, right? And then all of a sudden there are all these rules and all these regulations and all these limitations that you have to follow. And just like a rebellious teenager, who gets in trouble, and now there are all these rules. Well, now, you didn't offer rules before, and now you're trying to do these rules. It didn't quite work. Same thing with the American colonists. They were just sort of left to their own devices, and now all of a sudden have to start following all these rules and paying all these new taxes that they didn't have to pay for before. Again, Britain just thought, this is the reasonable cost of protecting you, right? But the Americans didn't see it that way. They saw it because, and you see this phrase up here, taxation without representation, because the Americans were not able to send any representatives to Parliament, and because Parliament was the legislative body that was voting for these taxes, the American colonists felt like their voice was not being heard. They were not being properly represented. Also in 1765, this act forced colonists to house and feed British troops. The name of the act is the Quartering Act. So this was another thing that really riled them up, because British soldiers were allowed by the British government to sleep in American beds and eat Americans' food, and the colonists were not happy about it. This is actually going to lead to the Third Amendment to the Constitution, which says that the government may not quarter troops during peacetime without the permission of the owner. So this Quartering Act is going to inspire one of our amendments. It's really not like, there's only been like one Supreme Court case dealing with the Third Amendment, so it really hasn't been an issue lately, but it was a huge issue back during the time of the Revolutionary War, where the government is trying to house troops in people's private homes, and that was a big deal to them at the time. All right. In July 1765, this group is formed. They used violence and intimidation to eventually force all British stamp agents to stop collecting the tax. Members included Samuel Adams, his cousin John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Paul Revere. These are all names that should be from fifth grade history, should be familiar names of American patriots. This group is called the Sons of Liberty. And so they're going to be the ones who really start to kind of rabble-rouse and cause trouble and, in moving us in the direction, rebelling against the British government and moving us in the direction of the American Revolution. That, by the way, that is a painting of Paul Revere, who, in addition to being a son of liberty and in addition to being lots of other things, was also a silversmith as well. And so you can see him holding on to a silver tea something. Anyway, let's move on. Next question. In March 1770, this event occurred when British soldiers fired their muskets into a mob of angry colonists, killing 5 and injuring 6. This was the very famous Boston Massacre. And I've actually been to this graveyard right here. You see this headstone right here, and you see the names Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus Attucks, who was the term that they used at the time was a mulatto mixed race, right? Person. He was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre. And Patrick Hart. We don't use the term mulatto, by the way, anymore. That's not considered appropriate. But mixed race, and it was people thought it was important at the time to make mention of that fact. And so anyway, killing 5, injuring 6, and then for some reason there's also this 12-year-old who was buried there as well. I don't know the full story behind that. So the reason why I mention this is just more, if you imagine the American Revolution as sort of this fire, and every so often kind of pouring gasoline on that fire, igniting it and inflaming it. And this is another one of those events that was pouring gasoline, metaphorical gasoline, onto the flames of revolution. I want to show you this image first. So this is an engraving by Paul Revere. You can see right here, Paul Revere. You can see the name down here at the bottom. Was one of the propagandists, right, trying to spread the message of the British were cruel. This was this was a total massacre, and American colonists were doing nothing, and they were just innocent and peaceful. And you can see just by the different evidence here, the fact that the British are below this building called Butcher's Hall. Was there really a building called Butcher's Hall? Well, according to Paul Revere's engraving, there was. And you can see the British officer yelling, "Fire," presumably, and just, all of these British soldiers just sort of callously firing into the crowd and blood being spilled. And there's even this innocent dog who's sort of in the way and a massive head wound here. I think we are to understand that this is Crispus Attucks right here, the black man whose blood is also being spilled. And so this very, very violent scene right here. There is a different engraving I want to show you. So this is the other view. So this is actually an engraving from a British perspective. And you can see that just by looking, first of all, there's no Butcher's Hall right here, right? And you can still, there's Crispus Attucks, who again figured prominently there. But here's, there seems to be a lot more confusion. And you see these British soldiers are kind of surrounded on different sides. There's much more of a gray area here in this engraving. So the reason why I bring these up is to show you, in every conflict, there are often two sides to the story, right? There are two sides, the side that is told by, in this case, the Americans, the side that is told by the British, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. But anyway, this is the Boston Massacre, and regardless of who started it and who fired the first shot and who the aggressors were and all of that, the bottom line is this was one of those major events that pushed us even closer to the Revolutionary War. All right. In December 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor, dumped 342 containers of tea. What was the name of this event? Again, something you should have learned in fifth grade history if you were here in California for history, and that is the Boston Tea Party. So they dressed presumably to blame it on somebody else, maybe. They dressed like Mohawk Indians. They dressed as Native Americans, dumped all the tea into Boston Harbor, and this was the Sons of Liberty who did that. All right. That's that event kind of pushing us closer. Which then I should also mention that the Boston Tea Party then led to the Intolerable Acts, the shutdown of Boston Harbor. Obviously, the British were very upset because the British take their tea very seriously. And so this led to consequences. Again, sort of that unruly teenager analogy, like you really screwed up, you really messed up, and now there's a serious punishment. And the people of Boston were very, very much punished by this. April 1775, colonists clashed with British soldiers at this battle known as the Shot Heard Round the World. And the Shot Heard Round the World is the battles of Lexington and Concord. Kind of collectively, there were two different areas of combat, but sort of collectively they're called the Battle of Lexington and Concord together. So this is 1775. So this is actual fighting and killing, right? So this is Americans and British, American colonists, British soldiers, clashing, shooting at each other, killing one another. So it's important to note that the fighting started before the Declaration of Independence was written, right? So this war kind of began before there was really a plan for what to do. What are the Americans going to be doing? So it started out as kind of this insurrection. It started out as this rebellion. And then it's important for these Americans who are in the Congress to go, you know what? Rather than us just being looked at as a bunch of rebels, as a bunch of insurrectionists, we want to be taken seriously. And so maybe we should do something to show to the world that we're not just a bunch of whiny crybabies. We're not just we're not doing this just because we're trying to get our way and we're pouting. There are serious concerns, human rights concerns that need to be addressed. And this is the way that we're addressing them. Which is why this leads us now into our next question on what date did the 13 colonies declare independence from Britain? So the answer we're looking for is July 4th. Now, I will come out and say, first of all, for those of you historians among us, because there may be, who knows, there may be a student or perhaps a grown-up in the family who's like, well, wait a minute, actually, Mr. Ippolito, they voted for independence on July 2nd, which is true. John Adams actually believed that our Independence Day was going to be July 2nd and that we would celebrate with fireworks, and July 2nd was going to be our Independence Day. That was the date that we voted to become independent. But the day that we actually voted to adopt the document, right? This document, the Declaration of Independence, the Second Continental Congress voted to adopt this document on July 4th, 1776. And so because that is the birth date of the document that states, in no uncertain terms, this is what we stand for. This is our mission statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We voted to approve, the Second Continental Congress voted to approve that document on July 4th, 1776, to be free and independent states from Great Britain. The actual signing of it was on August 2nd, or thereabouts. We think historians believe around August 2nd. So if anybody ever says, asks the question if it's ever in jeopardy, like when was the Declaration signed, not July 4th, around August 2nd. If anyone ever asks, when did we vote for independence, that was actually July 2nd. But July 4th, the reason why we acknowledge that as our birthday is because that's the anniversary of the signing, the vote on the Declaration of Independence. Thanks for sticking with me on that. And then finally, so these last few are just going to be really quick. One thing you remember from fifth grade history, I can't answer that for you, only you can. So just tell me, just what's one like fact or thing or lesson or something that stood out for you from social studies in fifth grade. And remember, you should have been studying, if you were a fifth grader in California, American history. If you were a fifth grader someplace else, just tell me something else that you remember about fifth grade. Who was your seventh grade history teacher? What I should have also added, what's one thing that's memorable about your seventh grade history teacher? You can answer that question. And then finally, the map skills. And so the map skills, this is not a question. These are just directions to do that map, right? The 13 colonies map. So if you're wondering, like, Mr. Ippolito, what do I do in this map? These are the instructions for that map, right? So you're doing this assignment digitally, but the map is actually a paper map that you're going to do and physically actually hand in, turn in. All right. Well, and by the way, I should also mention that if for absence or, whatever reason, if you are unable to turn in the paper copy, you could, for the map, you could turn the map in digitally using this assignment in Google Classroom. So you could do that as well. So there are multiple ways that you could turn that map assignment in. If you wanted to turn it in digitally, you could. Okay. I think that's it. And so I am now done talking, and thank you for listening. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time in Mr. Ippolito's history class. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.